Hi, this is Mark Orr with Mission Critical. Mission Critical is a series of podcasts that are designed to help you critically and hopefully think about how to change our world. We design these podcasts so that you can start and finish in usually under 20 minutes while you're on the way to work or while you're in the shower. I've listened often to podcasts that are 1 or 2 hours long, and I find those a bit too long. Our goal here is not to go in depth with a lot of details into a topic, but to present a subject in a way that provokes you, gives you enough questions and enough things to think about, that sort of mobilizes you and gets you thinking outside of the box. We're currently working on a series of podcasts, about 25 in all, that zero in or circle around the ASSEMBLI project that we're working on. ASSEMBLI is a tool that will help connect Christians and resources, leaders in local neighborhoods and nations all across the world to work in a radically new and more effective way to reach our world. Now, in these 25 podcasts, we've divided them up into 5 sections, 5 sets of about 5 podcasts each. So we're currently working on the section number 1, which is called The World in Crisis. The other sections build on that. The first one sounds a little bit negative possibly, but we want to encourage you that we need to begin with a clear understanding of what some of the challenges are, what we've called the crisis in the world today. And our goal is to move from that to a point of solutions. But we need to start with an honest understanding, not just of the surface problem, but what is really happening under the surface. The first section, which we call World in Crisis, leads us to the next one, which is hope and why it's doable. Then we move from there to the how, which is sort of like a blueprint of how this can sort of work out in a real world scenario. Then we'll go into section 4, which is all about assembly and the different features that are the very practical things, the tools that you and I can use to create change in the world. And lastly, we'll go into a series of 5, what we call an idea storm, basically helping ignite your imagination for ways that you can attain the hope and come to a point of believing that you can change your neighborhood and your nation, and you have ideas of how to go about that. So today's podcast is addressing the third part of the first section, this first section being the world in crisis, and we're looking today at the problem of logistics. We'll explore logistics, why it matters, and how it impacts you, and as a normal person in your neighborhood, in your nation, what does it mean for how you can change the world? What about logistics is holding you back? My approach to these 5 episodes is not to be exhaustive, but to explore these 5 constraints, 5 reasons that we're not doing more, 5 reasons that if we deal with them, we can have a greater impact in the world. So I want to encourage you that you're included in this. You might think that because you're not something else that it doesn't apply to you. But if you're a pastor, a mission leader, a business owner, or a teenager who cares about your neighborhood, and you feel like God is putting it on your heart that you should do something about that, this is for you. So let's look first of all at 3 definitions. There's 3 terms that really form the overall framework of this discussion today. The first term relates to something that I have been talking about for a number of years, what I call the supply chain problem. Supply chains are usually referred to in a business context when you're moving parts around the world to build things and so on. And I think it relates very much to the whole mission of the church and how we need to engage in the world more effectively. I don't hear people talking about the supply chain problem, and that's why we're talking about it today. So what is a supply chain? A definition of supply chain: a supply chain is the network of all the individuals, organizations, resources, activities, and technology involved in the creation and sale of a product. So that's the business definition of a supply chain. For our purposes, let's just modify it slightly and say that a supply chain is the network of all the individuals, organizations, we could add to that churches, resources, activities, communities, and technology that's involved in designing and implementing projects that change the world. Okay, so put that in the back of your mind. Keep that on the side burner for a moment. Let's look at the next definition, or the next term that is part of this. This is what I call excess capacity. Now, that also is a business term. The definition I'd like to offer today is this: excess capacity exists when a business is not operating at its potential and is able to easily increase production. Now, there's a couple of businesses that are very well known. You will know about these businesses that use and are almost entirely built around the concept of excess capacity. And that's Airbnb and Uber. Airbnb is built around the excess capacity that average people with homes have, that capacity that they're not using, a spare bedroom or a home or a basement suite and so on. So Airbnb has figured out how to take something that already exists, that's not being used, and put it to good use and help the homeowner make some money, and Airbnb also makes some money in the process. That's what Uber has done as well, finding people with cars, people with time, and a car that's not used all the time, and putting that to work as a taxi service. Now, I believe that there's a tremendous amount of excess capacity in the global church, and I'm going to get back to the specifics of that in a few minutes. For our purposes, this definition is useful to us, but I want to sort of reword it a bit to include some other angles. For example, excess capacity includes the resources of individuals, families, churches, and professionals that are not being used or not being put to work in ways that change the world. Now let's look at the last term that I'd like to introduce today, and that's logistics, the one that we've used to title this whole podcast. Logistics is the process of planning and organizing to make sure that resources are in the places where they need to be so that an activity or a process can happen efficiently. Now, some of you are military people. There's a whole military version of logistics. There's business versions of logistics. But in our context, I want to say it in this way. Logistics is the process of planning and organizing to make sure that resources are in the hands of Christians, leaders in every neighborhood in the world, so that the world-changing activity that we want to see happen can happen effectively and efficiently. Are we getting the resources we already have into the hands of the people who God is speaking to, who need to use them to implement projects that change the world? All right? So let's put this into a bit of a summary so you remember the three all together. And if you forget everything else about this podcast, but only remember this, here's the three simple points you need to remember. On the supply chain issue, it's fragmented. We have bits and pieces of supply chain. We have some larger organizations that are very efficient at moving material and things around to suit their purposes. But we don't have a coordinated, cohesive, global strategy to mobilize, to identify, mobilize, and distribute the resources of the church. We simply do not have that. And it's actually rather appalling that in today's age of technology, when we can move around millions of pieces of baggage through dozens of airlines and airports all over the world every day, but we still haven't figured out in the global church how to actually identify and move resources around to do the work that God has called us to do. So remember that about the supply chain. The second, on excess capacity, it's massive. The excess capacity of the global church is massive. I'm going to dig into that a little bit more in a minute. There is massive excess capacity of every type in the global church that is going unused. The third concept of logistics, remember this, there's no global plan. We do not have a global logistics plan to help the church and to help each one of us do the work of God more efficiently. And most likely, There's no plan in your community either. I hope there's exceptions, and I believe there are exceptions, communities that do this very well. But for the most part, communities, towns, neighborhoods do not have a plan for doing this. So let's get back to the core. Although we've gone through these three terms, supply chain, excess capacity, and logistics, the point isn't really those terms. The point is resources. This is about how we are stewards of the resources that we have. Resources are at the core of this discussion. So let's look at several types of resource that matter. In this topic, in this discussion today, we're going to look at 5 categories, just to briefly to bring them to the fore of your attention so that you can ask yourself, does this affect me? Am I a part of the problem? And how can I be a part of the solution in these areas? Let's look at 5 types of resource. First of all, I'm going to talk about skills. Now, normally when we talk about logistics, we're thinking about tangible things that we can, put in a box and ship somewhere. But I'm expanding that definition to include several different types of resources. So skills is one of those. Do we have an excess capacity of skills? Absolutely. We have skills and talents in the experiences of people, on the CVs, on the job descriptions of people that are going unused for the kingdom of God. It's not so much a physical thing that you can move around. It's more about matching. How to define skills in the most specific way and match it to the most specific need so that there's, as close as possible, an ideal match between skills and the needs that they could fulfill. Now, skills sharing, especially globally and cross-culturally, involve some logistical issues. They involve legal issues. How do you share your skill in another part of the world efficiently or in another culture, and how do you do it in a legal way, and so forth? That involves some logistical challenges and some legal challenges and so on. That's part of this discussion. How do we deal with that so that we can share skills across national borders, across cultures, and help each other as a global team, as a global body of Christ? Creating and giving contracts using blockchain, for example, could be an angle to start exploring how we can donate services that can become redeemed indirectly. So someone contributes a service, but it's fulfilled by someone else, and so on. So some of you that understand how blockchain technology works can begin to explore that. How do we leverage the technology we have to do a much better job of distributing the skill resources that we have around the world? The second type of resource we call knowledge. How do we make sure that the people who have the answers are connected with the people who have the questions? How much knowledge is going unused in the brains of retired people worldwide? The people that have the most experience and the most skill tucked away in their minds and in their hearts. When they come to the end of their careers or when they retire, they are an absolute gold mine of knowledge. But we have very poor systems of tapping into that and making sure that it's passed on to younger generations and passed across the world to other places where that knowledge can be used. The third type of resource is relationships. There's the old adage, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And this taps into that. How can we share and extend relationships so that this valuable resource is put to work for changing the world? Now, most people are very careful about their relationships. They guard their relationships. They don't want to easily share relationships because they don't want the relationship with a person passing on to another one who can then hurt the original relationship. I understand that. That's a challenge. But in communities are defined by relationships and how we help each other and the trust that we can build. So we need systems that help us build trust communities and connect communities to each other so that we can be at a place where we can share relationships in confidence and have the confidence to do that. The fourth area is money. And that's often the first one we think about. The first resource that everybody wants is money. And money is one of those valuable resources that we need to figure out. Now, in the area of money, there's a tremendous challenge because I believe there's an excess of money in every continent of the world. I'm convinced of that. I've lived in Africa. I've lived in Europe. I've lived in North America. I've lived in South America. And I can see the wealth that is existing in all of those continents. But there's a problem with the whole supply chain around money. There's practical problems like how do we legally move money from one place to another? But there's also possibly a bigger challenge is the trust issues. How does someone give to a project that they don't personally know but have the confidence that the money is going to be used in the right way? So it comes down to accountability issues, trust issues, and feedback and reporting and so on. Those are all challenges for sure. Those are valid concerns. But I believe that we can address those effectively if we put our minds together. We must, because we have the money and it's sitting in the pockets of people who are not investing it. Some research says that only 5% of people tithe. And even those tithers are concerned about how their money is being used. If we can tap into the other 95% and make it easier and better and more effective and more accountable in how we move money around the world to the leaders and the neighborhoods and the projects that really need that money, then we're going to greatly increase the effectiveness of the church around the world. The last section, the last type of resource I'll mention is materials and logistics. Logistics not just as a problem or a challenge, but logistics also as a solution, as an excess capacity. How much surplus material is lying around in basements, in warehouses, in shops, in your garage? How much room is there on ships, planes, cars, airline baggage that you've paid for that you're not using when you go on that trip? There is a tremendous amount of material lying around unused. And there's excess transportation capacity that could be used to move that material around to places where it's needed. Now, if you've noticed, when there's a crisis around the world, an earthquake or a famine or something, and big organizations are responding to that, they don't ask for material. They don't ask for blankets. They ask for money. Because they already have some of their own internal supply chains, and they just need to pay for that. So they take that route because there's a system that already works to make that happen. It's a lot harder to try to collect blankets from 1,000 different places. It's easier to collect the money and buy the blankets from one place. I understand that. I understand why it works the way it does right now. But I believe with the technology that we have, and especially the movement to recycling, the movement towards taking care of our earth, the movement towards not creating junk that becomes a type of pollution, that movement can be tied together with the technology that exists now to much more effectively move our excess capacity of material to places where it can truly be needed, and we can do so in an efficient way if we put our minds to it. 5 types of resources, 5 challenges, but 5 sources that can dramatically change our ability to engage in the world. Now, to help you think through this a little bit further, I'm going to suggest that there are 3 types of excess capacity. Okay? Now remember what excess capacity is. That's the ability to produce more that we're not actually using. So let's break it down into 3 more useful ways of looking at it. Okay? The first is what I call latent capacity. Latent. Okay? It means that the ability exists to create this resource, but we haven't created it yet. So We have tools around that can be used to create something, but we're not creating it. Why? Perhaps we haven't defined what the need is. Perhaps it hasn't been called for or asked for. Or we don't know that that latent capacity is there, or that latent capacity hasn't been offered. So there's that capacity to create things that don't yet exist. Okay? It might be in your business. It might be in your industry somehow. It might be in your community that latent capacity exists that can be activated. We have the ability, but we're not using it. The second type of excess capacity is what I call lying around capacity. Okay? Not a very fancy term, but I think it describes what we're trying to say here. There's simply stuff lying around, sitting there. It's already been created. It already exists, but it's lying unused somewhere, possibly in your home. That's capacity that can be harnessed, that can be mobilized. The third type of capacity is sharing capacity. So this is where people are using things, but they don't really need to. They can learn to share. Okay? So you have a car, but you can learn to share it. You have a home, but you can offer it to people who need it for a workshop or something. You have food, but you don't really need to eat as much, and you can share it. Okay? There's many things, especially in affluent societies, where we are using or employing for our own entertainment to excess. And we can give up some of those things and share them. So that's another type of excess capacity. So latent capacity, lying around capacity, and sharing capacity. Those are three ways of tapping in to that excess capacity. If we combine those three types and figure out how to effectively mobilize those resources, I am convinced that we will have all that we need to do everything that God has given us to do. So let me summarize again what I said a little bit earlier. On the supply chain, it's fragmented, but we can do something about it. On excess capacity, it's massive, but we can mobilize it. And on logistics, there's no global plan, and probably there's no plan in community. But we do have the ability and the opportunity, and therefore we must act on creating a global logistics strategy for global mission. There's no global scarcity. There might be regional scarcity, but on a global scale, there's no scarcity because there's always another place that has the excess capacity to supply to the place or the region that is lacking. The problem is logistics. We simply haven't developed the ways to use what God has already blessed us with. If this sounds depressing, don't let it be. I see it like finding gold deep in a mountain. We've just found something beautiful and wonderful. We know it's there. We just need to figure out how to get it. There's solutions for this, which we will explore in future podcasts. And I encourage you to just, after listening to this, sit down quietly and pray and say, God, how can I identify excess capacity in my life or in my organization or in my business? And how can I be a part of the logistical solution to help this work efficiently? So I encourage you to follow us at ASSEMBLI.net and join us for our next podcast, which will touch on the attitude problem of subsistence. Thank you for listening.